We've all heard terms like net zero ready, so on, bandied about for a few years, but what exactly do they mean? More importantly, what do they mean for those who construct and operate our built environment or our society in general? To lend their perspectives and help define net zero for the rest of us, we welcome Bolis Ibrahim, co founder and CEO of Argentum Electronics, Gregory Leng, creator and director of the Redscreen clean energy management software at NRCan's CanmetENERGY Research Center in Varennes, Tonja Leach, executive director of Quality Urban Energy Systems of Tomorrow, also known as Quest. So, thanks to all of you for joining me in this important discussion on net zero. Now, before we get into the meat of our conversation, it would be helpful for our audience and for myself as well to get to know a little bit more about you and your respective organizations. Bolis, why don't we start with you?
For sure. Yeah. So, hey, everyone. My name is Bolis Ibrahim, co-founder and CEO at Argentum Electronics, a company based here in Ontario. And our core business is bringing direct current power distribution to buildings, really making that technology more accessible for buildings to use. It's a real game changer for buildings because it reduces the amount of energy consumption that they consume by up to like 40%. And the reason for that is because around 80% of the energy consumed in buildings is direct current, but the utilities supply us with alternating current. So we're left making all of these inefficient conversions. So those are the core technologies that we work on. We also work on building intelligence systems, trying to make the building systems smarter so that they end up consuming less energy as well. And working on making the buildings ready for accepting solar systems, battery systems, EV charging on site, that sort of stuff. So that's what we do here at Argentum. Thank you, Anthony.
All of which are DC systems. So yeah, it sounds like you're well
Yeah,
positioned. Now, Greg,
yeah.
let me turn over to you now and what it is that you have been busying yourself with the last while.
Yeah, so I'm a director of the Redscreen Clean Energy Management Software, which is part of the CanMet Varennes Energy Research Labs with the Department of Natural Resources Canada. Been working on Redscreen since for the past 27 years. It was my master's thesis and then developed it as a product with the government. Yeah, so Redscreen is used by more than 750,000 users in every country in the world. And it is a clean energy management software that deals with energy efficiency, renewable energy, cogeneration, district energy, et cetera. And basic Redscreen, it does two things. It helps you determine the feasibility of these various projects, the energy, the costs, the greenhouse gas emissions, and the financial returns. And then in the last decade, we've built up a series of what are called performance analysis modules, which allow you to building in machine learning and things like that to actually do analytical analysis of buildings and factories and power plants to make sure that they're performing and operating at as expected. And then we've now rolled up and created a portfolio module that allows you to bring in all of your facilities, so thousands of facilities. For example, we have all 38,000 federal buildings coming into Redscreen for doing the federal government's greenhouse gas reporting, for example. Yeah, so Redscreen and my team in Varennes is about 33 of us right now working on Redscreen, and it's growing rapidly.
Just before I let you go and move on to Tanya, you had mentioned there are thousands of users worldwide. In how many countries now can you find Redscreen?
We've identified users in every country that have people. Every country that has people, we've identified Redscreen users. And it's also taught at 1,300 universities and colleges worldwide. So that's sort of another metric that we track. Yeah. So it's used worldwide. It's available in 37 languages now that cover 2/3 of the world's population as well. Yeah.
Amazing, amazing. Well done. And now, Tanya, I've saved the best for last. So you are the executive director of Quest, which stands for Quality Urban Energy Systems of Tomorrow. So tell me a little bit about yourself and your organization.
Thanks a lot, Anthony. Not sure I'm the best for last, but nonetheless, I think everybody is equally qualified here to bring lots of useful information to your listeners. So Quest, a little bit about us. We're a national nonprofit organization, work in Canada, kind of limit ourselves to the Canadian borders. And what we do is we work at the local level, trying to help communities both reduce their emissions, improve their energy efficiency, and also look for solutions that are integrating, things at the local level. So where can you get then added, value add from things like the integration of buildings and transportation systems, of waste systems with building systems as well. So, kind of looking for those integration opportunities so that we're improving efficiency while reducing our emissions, and also kind of generating and building an economic base for a community. As we know, our communities are increasingly struggling to kind of maintain themselves from an economic perspective. So really kind of looking at things from a multitude of different perspectives. We are Connector, bringing together a multitude of different stakeholders in that local space, from the municipalities and the staff in the municipalities themselves, with the energy utilities that serve them, to the builders and developers that are building out the infrastructure in those communities, energy service providers, more broadly speaking, and how do they work together? Who has what role and what responsibility in transitioning the systems that we have in front of us today to meet the objective of what we're going to talk about, net zero?
Thank you, Tonja. Now, I should mention, full disclosure to the audience and to the fellow panel members, I had interviewed Tonja last year, kind of roughly this time. So we have chatted a bit before. And Tonja, what I want to say, and I don't know if I said it then, is I appreciate what Quest is working on, in that you're trying to bring together these multiple stakeholders who all have some sort of input on our systems, on our communities. Now, getting to the meat of our conversation, over the years, I've read about and reported on numerous movements. Um, Probably the first significant one to my memory in my career would be the green building movement in the States about 20 years ago, with the founding of the U.S. Green Building Council and leadership in energy and environmental design lead rating system. Now, since then, there have been things like BREEAM, Building Research Establishment Environmental Assessment Method, which I think is more UK, possibly Europe. There's BOMA Best, ISO 50001 Energy Management, and so many others, similar ones. But now we've entered the era of net zero. And I know for me, it's still quite nebulous. I'm still trying to figure it out. And I'm assuming that is probably still quite nebulous in other people's minds. Now, Tonja, you and I have discussed net zero before. So I want to turn to you first. And you speak about it regularly as part of your work with Quest. So when the collective we speaks of net zero, what are we talking about?
Yeah, I think there's like the simple answer, which is we're talking about emissions, and we're talking about making a balanced equation. So any emission we're pushing into the atmosphere, we are removing from the atmosphere in one way or another. So that seems very simple, and mathematically that looks like a pretty simple equation. But the actual doing of net zero is where the complexity arises. So we use energy in every form of our daily lives, whether that is the heating that we have in our homes today or cooling we have in the summer, to the transportation systems that we're using, to the waste streams. It's everywhere in our daily lives. And so because we use energy in everything we do, we are producing emissions in the majority of what we do. And so as a globe, we are trying to and need to reduce our emissions down so that we're not driving more climate change and more global heating across the globe. So that is kind of in a nutshell what we're trying to do. As I said, the complexity of it is it's so very integrated into our daily lives. And the energy systems that we use today have been developed and built out over time. And so trying to reverse a lot of these things is very difficult. And we've gone through energy transitions historically, but every one of those transitions have been and transitions. So we have added something to our energy system. But what we're trying to do now is we're actually not really trying to add anything. We're trying to transition it all over to something that is clean and green and is not going to continually be a detriment to our, our way of life, the globe, essentially, our ecosystems, so that we're not continuing to push emissions into the atmosphere. So it is very complex in actually getting to those outcomes. The equation sounds very simple, but the actual doing of it is incredibly complicated, and it touches every component of of our lives. But it's also, we also have to think about this and how are we reducing emissions in how we're producing energy, but how are we reducing emissions in the end use and how we're using energy as well. And the solutions for those two things are actually quite different, and they often get kind of conflated and kind of seen as one and the same, and they're not. So I think that is another added complexity, and it is about the actual physical reduction of those emissions, but we have embedded systems, not just our energy systems, our regulatory systems, our legislative systems, our governance structures, et cetera, that also need to change if we're going to get to net zero and stay at net zero.
That is a very, very, I don't know if I want to say negative, but it is a very, it sets forth a very busy roadmap, I think, for how we get to net zero, because there is so much involved. Now, Gregory, I think at one point there, I also saw you nodding your head with some of the things that Tonja was talking about. So there are all kinds of systems, jurisdictions in what Tonja was saying. Now, just with your work, Redscreen and NRCan, how do you see the approach of how we're getting to perhaps some of the things that Tonja described? How do we start figuring out
Sure.
these complexities and make them less complex?
Yeah, no, so Tonja did an excellent job actually at describing the physics of climate change, and also helping me actually giving the policy context as well. So it's important for the listeners to understand, that the world needs to and is going to zero emissions. I mean, if we don't, you've all read the news and watched Netflix and everything else. And that is a major change. And so, the green building and LEED, that was great because that sort of got the ball rolling on green buildings and things like that. In my career, in industry and in government, it really has changed. In the past, even only 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I say, yeah, a lot of talk. Let's see, I don't say it really has changed. We see it from the global policy context, from the governments, from the corporations, from the NGOs and the private sector. So there's no reversing it in terms of the change happening now. I think Tonja's right, though, it's the barriers and getting over, we need to accelerate it. So that really is the challenge. I think the goals now are being set in the right direction. So I think one thing we need to clarify too, because it gets confused in industry, is net zero carbon versus net zero energy. And so energy, of course, is a main driver of carbon emissions, but from a practical standpoint and addressing barriers and doing things as cost effectively as possible, so that you can then do the less cost effective things using that money you've saved with cost effective. So there's no question your first step, first pass from an integrated perspective is things like energy efficiency, doing the cost effective, getting your energy consumption down, et cetera. But what we're talking about with net zero from a policy perspective is net zero carbon. It's not net zero energy, and because there are two very different paths. Because net zero energy basically says you get your energy consumption in your building sort of net zero. That means you do a lot of renewables on the building, and it doesn't really make sense from from multiple perspectives. If you can produce clean district energy, or clean renewables in a wind farm or a solar farm, it makes much more sense to bring that into the community, into the buildings, rather than trying to cover the entire buildings with solar panels and wind turbines and all that. So I think that's a real key thing that people have to understand. We're talking about net zero emissions. And then the issue is it really also depends on where you are. So in Quebec, for example, which has a very clean electric grid, you can't make the net zero emissions case to do photovoltaics or solar electricity, but you certainly can make the case to do heat pumps and things like that. So whereas in Alberta, which uses sort of coal, much more coal and gas, photovoltaics makes much more sense. So it really, these are some of the barriers that you need to address. You want to, as Tonja said, you can try to bring it down to a simple formula, but unfortunately you can't do that. My experience is, from my perspective, you can't take the engineering out of the engineering. You still have to be able to do the proper analysis. And so that's what Redscreen helps you do, is to say, well, okay, I'm in Quebec and I'm in this sort of building. So what are the best, most cost-effective options to get to net zero, so that we can do it so that the building owner is motivated, and that we as a society do not waste money on things that are not going to get us all to the right place in the end. So Redscreen helps make those decisions more at the building or portfolio level.
I like that you brought up some of those examples, Quebec and where their electricity comes from versus Alberta, because Tonja, this makes me think of a lot of the things that you write about and post about, and we discussed that. Solutions, there is no one silver bullet for everyone that works in every situation, regardless of where you are in Canada or on the planet. You need to use, intelligent people, intelligent software to figure out, okay, what's best in this location, what's best in that location. It sounds like Gregory is propping things that you've discussed and written about.
Yeah, it's great to see that and great to hear that. Yeah, and I think if you want to think of this as a pyramid, we don't necessarily need every building in and of itself to be net zero, but we need the collective to be net zero, right? We are striving for a net zero target in Canada. And so that there's going to be places where we can get closer to and maybe even go negative. There's going to be places where we can't get to net zero, right? There's industries that are really hard to abate. And so we have to acknowledge that, accept that, and ask ourselves, well, what is the offset of that going to be? And collectively, this needs to percolate up to being net zero.
Now, Bolus, I want to bring you into this. We've heard from Greg and we've heard from Tonja in terms of trying to understand net zero. And as I suspected, and Gregory, you highlighted, we're not necessarily talking net zero energy, but we're talking about net zero carbon, net zero emissions. That when the collective we speaks about net zero, this is what we're going for. So, Bolus, in your position with our Argentum, and perhaps even in your peers in the solutions provider space, what is the understanding? What is the thrust there as you guys come up with solutions for our building stock?
Yeah, got you. So I think Gregory touched on a great point there. There's two, like net zero is so many different things, but in the macro lens, you're talking net zero emissions. So basically, like whatever we emit into the atmosphere, that we're removing it, whether it's through like natural means like forests, or through real engineering feats like carbon capture. And then there's the micro sense of net zero, which mostly pertains to buildings. It could pertain to communities, it could pertain to like larger developments. But when we talk about buildings, then we're talking like net zero energy. That's where we spend a lot of our time. And our focus, our philosophy, and a lot of the philosophy of a lot of the like building industry is to make the building and its design more energy efficient, so that it consumes less energy to begin with. Because if you consume less energy to begin with, you're solving like the easiest part of the problem, is like not having to produce the emissions in the first place. Because capturing the emissions and removing the emissions once they're like out there is like really tough, especially like with non-natural means, like what we're doing today, what we're seeing with like carbon capture, which is really interesting technology out there. So on the micro scale, like the building scale, and buildings are like one of the worst like culprits in the problem. So designing those buildings from like, if you have the luxury of designing them from the start to be efficient, a lot of the times it's like the insulation materials that go into the building. Also like the other materials, we think about embodied carbon now. Like what are the carbon emissions that went into those building materials when they were created in those factories? So having this like holistic view, this like carbon accounting of the building, and then providing offsets or carbon neutral materials, or purchasing from plants that are carbon neutral. So there's so many different things we think about. We're more on the after side, like after the building is up and running, how do we make that building as energy efficient as possible? So that's what we do in a nutshell. But that should probably give like a better idea of like the net zero. But Greg and Tonja brought up some like really good points.
Well, and your last few points there sort of segue nicely into the next thing that I wanted to bring up, and that is our existing building stock. And again, Bolus, this is where you play. You know, after the buildings are already built and in operation, so our existing building stock is frequently maligned for energy inefficiency, excess emissions, and the like. Now, Bolus, you touched on this. You know, how solutions providers like Argentum are helping to tackle the problem, you know, with your DC solutions. But Gregory, let me turn to you and ask, you know, about RETScreen, because I'm not sure everybody would be familiar with REDScreen. How does that tool help people, basically figure out how to make themselves more efficient, how to make themselves less carbon intensive?
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So basically, we follow sort of a industry standard practice in the software, and it's all about trying to help the decision maker make the business case for implementing low carbon projects, often low energy projects, and looking at also from a holistic perspective. So not just looking at an individual measures, but the whole building, but also a portfolio of buildings and communities as well. Because when you start to expand your boundary conditions, you might have other opportunities like deep lake cooling in Ontario and things like that, that an individual building owner wouldn't look at by themselves. So I think Tonja's point, you know, looking more at the community level as well. So basically, there's sort of 3 steps that we found. Generally, if you follow them in these steps, first is minimize use. So you're looking for things, just do like you tell your kids, turn off the lights when you leave the room, shut the fridge door, don't take such long showers, things like that. Those are the no cost, super fast energy ways to not only save energy and money, but quite a bit of carbon too. If you're so minimize it, that applies to your house, that applies to a big pulp and paper mill. It's the same logic, the same process. So minimize use. And this is then when, you know, Bolus and others like control systems, and you can then do it intelligently in buildings, and that's used, and recommissioning of buildings, etc. So this is sort of the minimize use aspect. Start there. That's what energy efficiency is basically. Then there's a second aspect. The second sort of step is maximize efficiency. So this is when you start to look at replacing equipment, putting in more efficient equipment, such as premium efficiency motors and variable speed drives and waste heat recovery on ventilation systems. And then even looking at the building envelope, such as insulation and new windows and things like that. You're trying to get the demand down, both on the energy side and on the instantaneous power side or peak load side. If you do those steps, that's typically those follow in a logical, cost-effective order. And then the third step is you're sort of setting up for the last step, which is optimize supply. So when you get to that step, is it okay? Now, from a, you know, not only from a carbon lens, but from an energy lens as well, you can optimize supply by, for example, fuel switching, from going from natural gas condensing boilers over to heat pumps in Quebec. So that's fuel switching, and that can have a very positive carbon impact. And then and also on-site renewables, such as photovoltaics in Alberta, for example. So if you follow those 3 steps, we find that it works not only in individual buildings, it works at a community level, it even works in transportation as well. So we apply that methodology throughout REDScreen to help people plan in the most cost-efficient manner possible, and to also, as they go, be able to identify whatever metrics that are important to them. Is it carbon? Is it cost? Is it energy, or a mix of the three? So REDScreen helps you make those decisions rapidly.
Sorry, if I can just jump in, I think that was a really great explanation of kind of the methodology that one needs to apply in order to kind of think about the strategies that you need to deploy to bring down the emissions. I think the other thing, and what Gregory, you said in the opening, is you also need to kind of look at it from the perspective of the jurisdiction that you are in. And the solutions that are going to make sense are going to be directly related to the environment or the energy system that you sit within. So I think that that's an important kind of layer to kind of add on to this. And one other layer that needs to be added on is also about energy security. So from a resilience perspective and a reliability perspective, we do know that having access to energy, especially as we are facing more extreme weather situations, is really important to just being able to preserve life. So I think that that's another important thing to think about as we're making decisions about how we are making, what are we shifting in the systems in the built environment, to also making sure that we're understanding what the implications are from a reliability, resilience perspective as well. And I think the other thing that's really important here is that every decision that we are going to make is going to have trade-offs. We need to understand what those trade-offs are, and we need to be accepting of those trade-offs as we make these decisions. So there's no, as I said before, there's no silver bullet here, right? There's nothing that's kind of a get out of jail free card. So we need to really have a good understanding of those trade-offs. And I'm not sure yet in Canada, kind of broadly speaking, we have enough understanding of what trade-offs we are acknowledging as we are making some of these decisions.
I like that you jumped in, and it actually kind of segues to, I was going to turn to you now, Tonja, specifically, and hopefully I don't ask you to repeat everything you've just said, but as we look at this path of getting ourselves, getting Canada, ultimately the world, on a path of net zero carbon, net zero emissions, again, I probably already know this from your answer and from speaking with you before, but what are the perils of possibly taking a very prescriptive path to get there? And I would imagine that you would argue more for perhaps some sort of performance goal-oriented path for getting us there. Maybe you can speak to a little bit about how you see that performance rolling out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I don't think that a prescriptive methodology is one that's going to serve us well. Anything that we do that's prescriptive is top down, traditionally or typically. And really what we're talking about is a bit more of a bottom up. I'm not saying top down doesn't have its place, it certainly does, but we need a balance between top down and bottom up to get us to these solutions, which is kind of how you enter into the messiness of all of the decisions that need to be made. But as Gregory was talking, he was talking about what I would call is kind of a principled approach. And I think that that's where we need to be focusing, is really kind of what are the decision points that need to be made at different points in time? What are the trade-offs of each of those decision points that gets us to the solution, which Bolus has many of them in the built environment, which is great to hear, but gets us to that solution that we say, yes, this is the most appropriate solution for, based on these criteria that we have now kind of acknowledged. We're not doing enough work to kind of understand those trade-offs, to have enough of that data. RETScreen certainly does, I believe, help provide you with some of that data, or helps you analyze some of that data. But we need to be doing more to really understand that, make sure we've got good data that we're inputting into these decisions, making sure we're understanding when we need to leverage the various data points to kind of get us closer to the decisions that we need to be making. And then that gives us a smaller suite of solutions that we then have to weigh the pros and cons of, and then select the one that is going to get us to the best outcome. So I think that's more of a it's certainly not a prescriptive approach, it's more of a principled approach to getting to the solutions. Now, the challenge with all of that is there's this urgency, rightly so, of climate change. And so we are, as a society, wanting to just jump to the kind of simple solution and implement. And I think if we do that without doing things like leveraging RETScreen and other tools like that, we run the risk of a number of unintended consequences, such as perhaps not having the reliability of energy, or seeing energy costs rise too greatly, which puts more people into energy poverty, which makes the momentum of driving towards net zero really difficult to maintain and to accelerate, which we must do.
A principled approach. I like that. Bolus, let me turn to you because I haven't heard from you in a while. So what do you think of what we've heard in terms of that path to getting us to net zero, and Tonja highlighting the principled approach? For someone like Argentum, or perhaps some of your industry peers, would you agree that sort of looking at the performance characteristics or the principled approach across various jurisdictions is probably the best way to move forward on this path to net zero?
Yeah, I think that if you prescribe something, you're always going to miss an outlier somewhere. And because, especially with like HVAC systems, because climates are so different across different places, it should be a performance-based approach where there's like a performance target, and that we, like, if you look at the way California's building code is split up, like they split, because California is like quite like long, so they have like several different climates, so they split the building code up into like separate like regions. I think there are like 13 of them. I could be wrong on that, don't quote me, but there are several different like places where the building code like differs. So I think a principled approach where there's a performance target is really important, then gives the owner flexibility to use something like Redscreen, and then where they can see like all of the different options for them for their HVAC systems. For electricity, for energy-based systems, I have a bit of a different like thinking or mindset. I think that a mix of like prescribing something and a performance-based approach works if you're doing it across, like, for example, like across all Ontario. Like the energy systems here are like pretty similar, especially for like the majority of the population. So like really prescribing to buildings, and we do this a little bit in the building codes and the electrical codes, is like we say like this is the way it should be done, especially for like safety purposes. But I think more and more we're looking at like these are becoming like industry standard, most energy efficient approaches for the electricity systems. Now for HVAC, again, I think it's like much different, because like insulating the building, choosing the right windows, like these are all like circumstantial based on like where the building is located physically. So I think a mix of these two approaches. I really like the like looking at a performance target and then letting the building figure out, or their engineering consultants figure out how to get there. I think that makes a lot of sense versus like saying it should be done like this way. Hopefully I caught that correctly, Tonja.
Yeah, no, I think you did.
Okay, cool.
It's just kind of reflecting on it, and I always like think of things in the community space at the community level. And yeah, we do need, I think, a bit of a blend of kind of prescriptive with this performance-based approaches to really drive us down there. I think really the important piece is that we've got really good data coming in at the front end of any of those decisions, and we're understanding what the trade-offs are that we're kind of making as we're coming to the conclusions and making those decisions. We also have to appreciate that every building, every vehicle that we drive, we all exist within a broader energy system. One of the things that I'm wanting to see more of is policy at the local level that is driving the energy systems to transition. And so, how is it that we are doing that? How are we encouraging partnerships? We've seen the hybrid heating model coming to fruition in Quebec. That is really interesting. I think that's the first time, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's the first time we've seen something like that happening in Canada. And I think it's really interesting to see, because what it does is it increases the reliability of the system, keeps the costs low, because you're not having to produce this immense amount of additional capacity. And we know that, so you're reducing the reliance on natural gas for heating in those homes, because they're putting in a hybrid heating system. So they're using heat pumps for the majority of the time with a trigger. I think at a -13 or -14 degrees, that switches them over to the natural gas system. At the same time, the natural gas system is starting to blend in renewable natural gas. I think in time, and not too much time, we'll start to see some blending of hydrogen in there. So that whole system is actually reducing its emissions at the same time. So I think these are the interconnections, the energy system integrations that actually are really valuable in helping us get closer to this objective of net zero. Everything new we can build or we are building absolutely should be meeting that standard so that it is going to be net zero regardless. But we've got a lot of built infrastructure. So how do we kind of put into place some of these integrations that help to reduce the emissions down? I think another example of that is distributed district energy systems. Greg, you mentioned that earlier as well. Great examples of that across Canada already, but we're just not seeing the deployment of those systems. So Southeast Falls Creek, which many would remember as the Olympic Village in Vancouver, is actually a waste heat recovery system from the sewage system from that community. And it provides, I don't know what the data today, but roughly about 90% of the heating for that community. So there's really great examples that we're just not seeing deployed at scale across Canada. And I think that's a big part of what we're trying to do, is try to kind of build the awareness to some of these solutions as well.
Yeah, so I think, it's kind of a nice bridge, bridge between Tonja and Bolus. Again, sort of the broader policy and planning perspective that looks beyond just individual buildings, even interprovincial and nationally. But then right down to the practical, DC motors in buildings and all that, which Bolus is working on. So for example, some of the work we're doing with Redscreen, we're working with the independent electricity system operator in Ontario, doing deep demand reduction archetypes for Redscreen. So we're already dealing with the energy side, but we're going to be doing the power side, instantaneous power. Of course, because they want to be able to manage peak loads. And from our perspective, from the government, we're looking at the broader perspective, which is, well, if everybody's going to start switching over to heat pumps at some point, and if everybody's going to start plugging in electric cars, we've got to start making more and more room on the grid to be able to supply that. So that's one of the reasons we're doing that. So that's bridging the utility planning side with the ISO. But it comes down to practical applications that Bolus is doing, which is, the DC motor or the DC applications that you're doing, are they also, reducing at peak load periods and things like that, because it really, this whole system approach makes a difference. And just one last comment, I agree with the prescriptive method. In some cases, it might make sense, sure, but instead of incandescent light bulbs, buy LEDs. So there's some prescriptive that just makes sense. It's a fact sheet's all you need to help move the market along. But even in Quebec, for example, like if you do a lighting efficiency retrofit, it's fantastic, cost effective, et cetera, do it. However, we remind people, if you do the holistic energy simulation of the building, you have to understand that you're increasing your greenhouse gas emissions in Quebec when you install LED lights. And everybody's like, what? And it goes, because what happens is they're so efficient, they have less waste heat coming off, and therefore the natural gas heating system has to kick in to make up for that waste heat not coming off the lights. Now, I tell people, do the LEDs. It makes absolute sense. That'll pay for the PV systems later and all that. But when you look at the system impacts, and if carbon is a key metric, which is and becoming more, you do need to look at the performance base and make those performance-based decisions.
Are you possibly suggesting that the door might be cracked open just a little bit for those much beloved incandescents to make a return?
No, because because a heat pump is so much more efficient than just letting incandescent the waste heat. So no, I'm not proposing that. But when I was in university at McGill 25 years ago, Hydro-Quebec used to have ads to tell you to leave your lights on all the time, including during the summer, and outdoor lights, because they were trying to level the load, and they were all about just you buying electricity. Anyway, so things have changed in a positive way, but
what I want to get to right now is separating net zero, bona fide net zero solutions, things that actually help advance us along that path toward net zero 2050 versus hype. Because with so many other things, there has been a lot of hype, a lot of marketing hype, greenwashing. So how does and Gregory, I'll turn to you first. How do we, or how does an owner separate something like, perhaps a bona fide solution that Bolus is offering versus, something they found online and it's like, oh, this is going to save my building, save the world. How does one cut through the marketing gobbledygook?
So I recommend people try to remove the emotion from the decision. So I think the emotion is important because we, of course, care about the planet and greenhouse, climate change and all that. But when you're making decisions, it's really important to try to remove the emotion and focus on the logic, And so, part of the objective of Redscreen was we sort of call it the truth teller. It's like, and we tell, it's usually the developers developing like solar power plants, whatever, we say, don't try to convince yourself. I said, let the data speak for itself. Don't, because the moment you start playing those games, you're potentially going towards bankruptcy or whatever. So, and it's actually not that difficult to calculate. So we provide the free version of Redscreen Online where we have archetypes that you can just click of a button depending on where you are, and it'll quickly give you an idea at least, and then you can verify it. But understand what is important to you too. What is the decision makers what is your definition of cost effective? A school board might be 10 years, and so you can do more carbon intensive reduction efforts, whereas if you're a pulp and paper mill, if it's not within 1 year payback, they're not even interested in talking to you. I mean, because a lot of these companies are worried about just going bankrupt within a year. So Redscreen does that, so we provide the multiple metrics. So understand what your decision points are too. For me as a homeowner, I will use Redscreen for some parts of my house, but some stuff I'm going, no, I want the most efficient, because if I'm going to, anything I do, I'm going to put the most efficient, because I know even without doing the analysis, it's going to get me in the right direction. So ultimately, it's about doing logic. And my recommendation is if you follow those sort of 3 steps, minimize use, maximize efficiency, and optimize supply. Even if you don't get them exactly right, it's what we used to call no regrets actions. It's like if you start with the first one, you're going to get everything in the right direction, and you're going to save money, save carbon, save energy in the process, and set you up for the more complex systems that need to be added after. So
yeah, I like
very
that.
good. I like that. No regret actions. Oh, sorry, Bolus, you were going to jump in there.
I was just like one addition. Like I really like the removing emotion from the decision making process is very important, especially when you're like deciding something like that is like in its nature very emotional or has an emotional tie, especially people that like have this deep care for the planet. I think another like easy tell, like when you look at these technologies, is if you look at the fundamental economics. If you look at like the payback period and the ROI, the capital expenditure, and the lifetime, like the usable lifetime of the system. If you look at the fundamental economics of any system, you can quickly sift out like what is truly, and then of course you compare that with the energy savings potential or the carbon offset potential, whatever it is that you're comparing. When you compare the fundamentals of like the technology and you like kind of separate it from the marketing, it's really easy to tell like what is like a truly a good technology or something that is more marketing than technology.
So Bolus, it sounds like what you're saying is when it comes to a solution, and you are a solutions provider, so you would probably also be affected by, let's say bad actors in the market. So you're a bona fide solutions provider, and I think what you're saying is if it sounds too good to be true, then it probably is. There will be some investment there. There will be some work involved for implementing a bona fide solution.
Yeah, of course. I mean, like it does sound good and it is good. I think that like the building owners, and actually it's like the onus should be on the solution provider to provide the economics up front that the building owner can then do their due diligence on and verify to make sure that those are factual. And if those economics are positive and the building owner, usually it's like the financial controller, whoever is like in charge of the finances on the project, now we'll take a look at those, and usually they end up making the final decision. So if the economics are sound and the carbon potential, like the carbon saving potential is sound as well, usually those are good solutions. But I think that instead of like presenting these like in the sales presentation, more like selling like the marketing pieces, I think more time should be spent on the project economics, the lifetime, the installation process, the maintenance process, like all of these things that go into the project. I think that also like makes the sale a lot easier. But I think it is tough for solutions providers when there are a lot of them out there that are selling hype, because then the building owners who do catch on to the hype, they become very careful, which could be a good thing as well. But they do become very careful, so it makes like our job a lot harder in terms of like pushing through the noise. But yeah, it is definitely like the bad actors do make it harder. It's a lot of noise in the space.
And then to your point, you need to work harder to cut through that noise. Tonja, let me close with you again with Quest. You touch and connect with so many different stakeholders. How do you, for yourself, and how do you help them cut through what is hype and what is bona fide?
Well, one thing I was going to bring up was, is there anybody who's willing to invest in your solution? And really what I'm pointing out there is there's organizations, I'm going to reference one of them because they're a supporter of us, Ecosystem, based in Montreal, does work in Toronto and other jurisdictions, even down into the US as well. And their business model is actually that if there are going to see a return from the emission reductions or the energy savings, they will, there's no capital outlay for you as a building owner to install those systems. The relationship is that those returns go to them, right? So that's how they're getting paid to do their work. So if there's somebody out there that is willing to, take that return on your behalf so that you can have that infrastructure applied into your building, then most likely you've got a bona fide solution. If there's nobody who's willing to take that on, I think you've probably got something that's got a bit of marketing hype behind it that perhaps you need to do a little bit more research on. So I'm not sure that that's the penultimate way to know, but it's certainly one way. If nobody's willing to invest in that solution within your building, then that's probably telling you a pretty strong message.
No, that's a great indicator, Tonja. Great indicator.
Yeah, that's a good tip. I've not thought of that. I'm glad you brought that up. So in conclusion, Bolis, Tonja, Gregory, in trying to reach net zero by 2050, and Bolis, I'll start with you. What do you see as the biggest challenge over the next 30 years, and where do you see the greatest opportunity?
I think the largest challenge is the population growth. So like as we move forward in time, this problem gets a lot harder because the population is growing so quickly. So that's the biggest challenge. The biggest opportunity I see is in the indoor environments where people stay. So like their homes and their workplaces. So buildings really. And of course I'm biased because this is like my area of work, but I think that perfecting buildings so that they do not consume more energy than they create on site, which is net zero energy, or they consume not as much as they consume from their district energy, like where if they have a local energy facility. I think that is a huge key, because a lot of the energy that we consume, I think it's almost half of the energy consumed here in North America is consumed by buildings, if not more. And I think that that's like a real big opportunity, is the indoor environments where we live, perfecting those indoor environments so that we're using as little energy as possible, and possibly like generating, like with the small roof space that we have, generating more than we need that we can then share with like electric vehicles, etc.
In terms of how to get to the perfect building, Gregory, that's probably where Redscreen could lend a hand. Let me put the same question to you then. In trying to reach 2050, net zero by 2050, what do you see as the biggest challenge over the next 30 years, and where do you see the greatest opportunity?
Yeah, so the biggest challenge is, going beyond the 30 to 40% cost-effective energy efficiency projects. So you can get those. The system's sort of already set up to do that. Tonja mentioned energy service companies. And so that is working well and it's growing. Utilities are part of it and the whole bit. It's getting the next part. It's the carbon part. And as Tonja mentioned, there's no free lunch. And this is going to be the challenge, that going to the next part is, sure, it'll become more cost effective over time as the volumes increase, but it's not going to be free. So carbon pricing certainly is helping. And then, so the last challenge will be it's more of a political challenge, both at the federal and provincial levels, because as governments come and go and different parties come and go, they will have different objectives. And that's why that's worked in our democracy. But it does provide challenges, because you might start with a program that gets you net zero, then all of a sudden the government changes and that's not a priority. So I think the political challenge and the starting and stopping is going to be there. However, the opportunity is tremendous. I now have two friends who started renewables that are both worth over 500 million US, starting solar companies, etc. It is the industry, it's the opportunity, and it's fun. Who doesn't want to help the planet? And you can make money at the same time. And for me, when you combine those two, it's going to happen, and it is happening, and it's going to be huge. And so really the challenge, the opportunity is, how do we do it much faster, much bigger, but in a smart way? And so I'll leave it at that.
Well, what you just described at the very end there almost sounds like a free lunch, but Tonja, let me put that same question to you, and I'll have you close us out. So in trying to reach net zero by 2050, what do you see as the biggest challenge over the next 30 years, and where do you see the greatest opportunity?
Sure. Well, I think that both Bolis and Greg have offered some really great kind of entry points and kind of examples of those challenges, and I would echo those first and foremost. We are trying to disaggregate both our population growth and our economic growth, which we want to maintain, right? We're looking to continue to see growth, and yet we're trying to pull emissions down at the same time. So that in of itself is a massive challenge. So coming back to kind of somewhere where I started, I guess, one of these opportunities is really, in my mind, is kind of the next big thing, the next big step that we have to make is, yes, we need to continue to focus on what I call the widget. It's probably not the right term, but kind of the innovation on the widget side, right? And making sure we've got new technological solutions, but we need to really shift our focus over to looking at the softer things, the policies, the legislation, the regulatory structures, the governance structures, these unsexy things that there's no ribbon cutting to go with them. But these are the structures that our society is built upon. And until we get those structures evolved to be sustainable as net zero, then we're not, we're going to be, that's going to be, so it is both a challenge, but an opportunity. And I would say that to kind of put a bow on this, Anthony, in my opening, you said that this sounds like, really negative and a massive challenge. Well, we should see that as like being super exciting, that we are a part of making this transition happen, bringing our brilliant minds together to find those solutions and understanding the numerous different pathways that we have to execute on to get us to that net zero outcome, so that we are leaving behind a planet that is better than the one we received. And I think that is really exciting.
Well, you weren't kidding, Tonja, when you said you were going to put a nice little bow on top of it at the end there. Nicely said, nicely done. And I do believe, and we have three of you right here, brain power that we need for this path moving toward net zero by 2050. Thanks to all of you for lending that brain power to this discussion, and but thanks again so much to all of you for lending your expertise.
Yeah, and thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us, Anthony.